Hello, this is Mike, and today I'm going to be talking about effective instruction in history, social science. So let's go ahead and get started here. So I wanted to begin my presentation by first talking about differentiation and scaffolding, which I feel is one of the most key elements in providing effective instruction for our students. Primarily, we have to focus on varying our methods of delivery, and what I mean by that is that we're not going to stand up in front of our classroom and deliver a PowerPoint presentation all the way through and expect students to just retain all the information that way, but rather we have to vary means of delivery by providing them different ways of learning and taking in information. So that could be represented by a video for our visual learners. And for instance, the video could have visuals and it could have subtitles for our English learners and um, hearing impaired. So those are some basic ways in which where we can differentiate and scaffold for our students. But not only that, we also have to have our students be literate and have access to text-based materials. So how are we going to scaffold and vary the method of delivery with the text? Well, it primarily in history and social science, there's a lot of documents that we have to read, primary and secondary sources. So one way to scaffold and differentiate would be to have definitions in bold on the side for our struggling learners. Or we can also have students um, access the same level of information. If text is a little bit more complicated, that could be reserved possibly for our advanced learners, but a secondary source with the same information could be given to struggling readers, English learners. That way they'll have that way they'll have access to the same level of information, but just at a different from a different point of view or delivery. Another good way is to delve into their funds of knowledge. So this is another thing that we have learned and discussed is understanding that our students are rich with knowledge already. It could be home based, it could be cultural, it could be familial, and there's already something that we can work with. So by tapping into those funds of knowledge and really getting to know our students, which is the only way we'll be able to have access to this, will we be able to latch on to some piece of information that we can work with to really deliver and differentiate for our students in that way. Another good means of differentiation would be using analogies. So you can make comparisons between daily life and historical events to make historical content more relatable to our students. One way that, off the top of my head, I remember I did this in my classroom was when we were talking about the Indian Removal Act. I showed my students a video about the Keystone pipeline that was a few years ago and tied it into the lesson of the day because a lot of my students weren't aware that the Keystone pipeline was an event that occurred. So I showed them a video where I was making I was trying to make it relevant for them to understand that this has been an ongoing issue where Native American people have clashed with the federal government and have been protesting and fighting for their rights. So I think it was important to show them that these struggles, although they're not exactly the same, they continually progress and shift throughout time. So that was one way where I was able to use analogies and use different sorts of ways to tie in historical events together. As I already mentioned, multimodal representation is key. So videos, audio, text. And finally, one thing that I do use a lot in my classroom or did before this coronavirus thing hit would be grouping. So strategically grouping students, pairing up students who have IEPs or are SPED with students who would be cooperative, but still a little bit more advanced. And that way, this I'm basing off of Vygotsky, because as he says, learning is social. So that way we can deepen their understanding and meaning of different views and have them collaborate together and work together to really just uncover content. Group projects are a good way to do this. If you're having them do like a gallery walk or poster board, and just um, they can divide the task based on their strengths, those that are more artistically inclined or those who prefer to present. Um, each student is taking a role and really just um, going after it. And next would be modeling. It's very, very important for us as teachers to model what we want our students to come away learning and how we want them to actually do it. So show students what a successful final product is supposed to look. This could be even in the beginning of a lesson where I'm usually presenting a graphic organizer on the board, and I have to, you have to read every single word of instruction and repeat it, and um, check for understanding, make sure they're following along, highlighting key terms. So a guided reading is always good for them to really be able to grasp what instructions you're trying to give them. So a lot of the times I like to read the instructions along with them, have them highlight keywords, and possibly have some of the students read the instructions out loud to me too. That way I make sure that they are grasping what is being asked of them. Another way would be to model quickly how to start like a response. So you can model a citation according to this document blank, and that way they have an idea, and you leave it on the board for reference and that also serves as a visual scaffold, I feel. It really helps to clarify and help students to understand what the purpose of an assignment is. So it's helpful to explain to your students why they're doing what they're doing, and how it's really ultimately going to tie into the greater essential question that we have been studying. It's a good way to exercise academic language with them. So you're modeling that teacher talk, you're having them use key terms that are going to be representing themselves throughout the unit. And it's also a good way to build on their prior knowledge. So by modeling or presenting information to them, you get to really understand whether they already knew about the topic or how much work you have ahead of yourself, and you can plan accordingly. Instructional sequencing is key. So a lot of the times I start my classes by reading the essential question, or have a student read it for me. That way they start the morning by thinking about or knowing that there's a purpose to the day. This is what we're going to be focusing on, this is what we're going to be talking about, and ultimately you want the day's lesson to tie together with the essential question. Another aspect of sequencing is on the board, I like to have do now and do later prompts, so they know to come in the classroom, fill in their homework, turn in their day's work, things like that. I feel like a routine is really important, especially right now, like I mentioned earlier with the coronavirus thing. A lot of the time, I even notice in my personal life, if I don't have a schedule set, I just lose track of what day it is, lose motivation. So I feel like students need structure and they need a familiar routine to be able to not only cope with something like what's going on right now, but really to just have their minds working and progressing inside of the classroom. So building a routine, building a class culture is very important. And students are going to know if you have a good instructional sequence. So they'll let you know by how blank their stares are or not. And you want to start with the ending in mind always whenever you're planning any sort of lesson. If if your ultimate goal is to have them do a group presentation, okay, what are the steps that you're going to take them through to actually lead them to the final product? One way to do that is you can assess formally or informally to see whether you need to backtrack or you need to re-emphasize some points in your teaching. And this will help identify what we should and should scaffold for our all of our learners. And finally, academic language. So academic language is tremendously important, especially when you're dealing with students who are a lot younger, like my 8th graders. It's crucial for English learners to be able to practice academic language and teacher talk. So putting up sentence frames and graphic organizers or up on the board is really a tremendous help, because a lot of the times students have an idea, in my experience, in mind, and they just don't really know how to verbalize it or put it into a sentence. So when they see something on the board that they can just reference, then they get the flow going, and they can independently work. So it's really just something that we can help them practice. Like I said, teacher talk is something that students need to work on by using, especially in their papers when they're writing, therefore, moreover, and just avoiding colloquials or just basic everyday street talk, things like that. Agree and disagree statements are huge. A lot of the times when I'm doing my avid tutoring, I would hear students disagree with each other by saying, that's dumb, that's stupid, you're wrong, instead of saying, I respectfully disagree, or I see your point, but, or however, so you kind of have to train students to speak a certain way, speak academically, and it's not something that people just practice at home or with their friends. So it's really discipline based and academically based. So they have to learn it from somebody, and that's us. Again, another thing that alludes to academic language and these agree disagree statements would be the classroom culture that you establish. In my class, I really like to emphasize that we were respectful of each other and each other's ideas. So even if you completely disagree with somebody, with your peer, you don't berate them, you don't talk down to them, you just tell them that you don't see eye to eye with them, and you present your evidence as to why. That's what history is, just presenting evidence and making claims by supporting that that evidence. And discipline-specific language is also crucial to academic language, especially in history and social science. So there's a lot of words that we as history teachers tend to take for granted because we've been learning about it so long and reading so many documents and books and what have you. That something as simple as talking about a ruler, obviously this has multiple meanings. To a student, it could mean an object to measure, but a ruler, it could be a king or a queen, someone who has power and authority over others. This one I chose specifically framers because I was talking in last semester to in my methods class to somebody who was getting their credential in history too, and they were a they were an English major. So when I talked about the framers, she just had this blank look on her face, and I said, "Oh, the framers that's what they call the founding fathers who developed the Constitution." So I took it for granted, and I didn't realize that this basic language for social science people can be completely alien to someone who maybe is a math person or a science person, and so on. So it's just something that we have to keep in mind as teachers, that something that might seem common sense to us,